So for this session, we will talk about your completing the audit. So in completing the audit, generally, this is already almost at the end or the last part of your audit engagement or your audit process before you form and express your opinion and completing your audit documentation. Normally, this completing the audit again is at the end, together with opinion and documentation. Now, before we go forward with completing the audit, let's just have a quick recap on our audit process or the whole audit engagement. So normally, your audit engagement starts with a pre-engagement activity. So under pre-engagement activity, generally, what you do here is to determine the preconditions of the audit. So what do we mean by preconditions of the audit? This is whether you will accept the engagement or not. In knowing the conditions of the audit, generally, the following are your items to consider. First is the competency, whether you will be able to provide the audit engagement. Next, whether you are also capable, so capability. Third, the independence of the firm or the auditor. And then lastly, the integrity. So the following are, again, your pre-engagement activities. You look into competency and capability, the independence and integrity. Once you already have a look into these preconditions of audit, now you try to agree and enter into the engagement. Now, in entering the engagement, generally, there are three main processes. So what are those three main processes? We have your risk assessment, you have your responses on the assessed risk, and then lastly, you have now your evaluation and conclusion. And evaluation and conclusion talks about the process of completing the audit, forming an opinion, and documentation. Now, let's go to your risk assessment. Let's go now to your risk assessment. So risk assessment generally is a cycle. And in risk assessment, the following are the items that you do. First, you look into your risk assessment procedures, and then you determine the STD of the audit. So when we say STD of the audit, is scope, timing, and direction of the audit. So after you determine the STD of the audit, you now look into the nature, timing, and extent of your audit procedures. And then in determining the nature and timing and extent of audit procedures, you create your audit plan. And then after that, you look now into the nature, timing, and extent of managing the engagement. And how do you manage the engagement? You now direct, supervise, and review the engagement. Direct, supervise, or review. Now, once you determine or once you finish your risk assessment, the next portion is the responses on your assessed risk. So, what are your responses to assessed risk? Normally, you call this one your audit procedures. Now, in looking into your audit procedures, you must look first as to your approach or whether you rely on your control or purely substantive. So it's either control approach or it is primarily substantive approach. If that is control approach, generally you do test of controls. While if it is primarily substantive approach, you do substantive tests. And in your substantive test, that can either be tests of details or any analytical procedures. And once you finish your audit procedures, then perhaps you can also update your risk assessment. And once you finish your risk assessment and responses on the assessed risk, you're ready to evaluate and conclude. And again, in your evaluation and conclusion, you complete the audit, you form an opinion, and make your audit documentation. So let's start our completing the audit. Again, it's a process. You start with risk assessment, you respond on those assessed risks, and now you evaluate and conclude. So you've done already or discussed risk assessment and responses on the assessed risk. We are now under completing the audit. So let's start with completing the audit. So completing the audit are wrap-up procedures on an audit engagement. So wrap-up procedures on an audit engagement. So generally, these procedures are performed and are necessary to complete the audit. And the ones who normally perform this completing the audit or the completion of the audit are the senior members of the audit team or the audit managers. Because generally, the items on your completing the audit are subjective of judgments. Okay? In completing the audit, generally, it is based on subjective judgments and not based on transaction cycles or accounts. So since it is based on subjective judgments or not about transaction cycles or accounts, the ones who can really perform the audit are the audit managers or senior members of the audit team. And it is not only purely your audit members. So what are the items under your completing the audit? First, identifying liability items. So in identifying liability items, the following are to be done. We search for any unrecorded liabilities and perform other procedures. Generally, in performance of other procedures, we look into your claims and litigations. So in your claims and litigations, generally, it creates a liability. So what we do in your claims and litigations is we try to communicate with your external counsel. We try to communicate with external counsel. So in identifying liability items, again, we look for unrecorded liabilities and we perform other procedures. Another item in the completion of your audit is the addressing of required disclosures. And what are those disclosures? Disclosures from related parties, disclosure from going concern, disclosure from subsequent events, and generally, we look into the different lists of disclosures required under our PFRSS. So that is a review of adequacy of disclosures. There is a list of required disclosures, and we look if ever all of those items that is already disclosed in the financial statement that we are auditing. Aside from addressing the required disclosure, we also look into the overall review of engagement. So in your overall review of engagement, we perform analytical procedures, we review working papers, we evaluate audit findings, we communicate with audit committee, form an audit opinion. And then other final procedures, we have your obtaining of management representation letter, completion and documentation, and communication with those charged with governance. So for completing the audit per se, we will only discuss these items. Search for unrecorded liabilities, perform other procedures, review related parties, review of going concern, review of subsequent events, review of adequacy of disclosure, and perform analytical procedures. But all of these other items will be part of your audit opinion and audit communication and documentation. So these items, all other items under completing the audit, will be placed under audit opinion, communication, and documentation. So our main focus only are the 7 items that are encircled herein. So let's start now with the first item of our completing the audit, and that is identifying liability items, the search for unrecorded liabilities. So in identifying liability items, again, what do we need to do? We search for unrecorded liabilities and we look into litigation, and claims. Let's start first for the search for unrecorded liabilities. So why do we need to search for unrecorded liabilities? Because one assertion of the management is the completeness assertion. And under completeness assertion, the main problem here is that liability tends to be understated. So completeness, assertion, and the issue relating to liability is that liability normally is understated. And since it is understated during the completion of the audit, or normally it is understated during the completion of the audit, we perform certain audit procedures. And what are those audit procedures in the search for unrecorded liabilities? The first audit procedure is to review subsequent cash disbursements. So how do we review subsequent cash disbursement? Now we look into the cash payment. So for example, this is the calendar year, this is the end of the year, and there will be cash disbursements after the end of the calendar year. So what we do is we look into the cash payments in the subsequent period that may provide evidence on any liability that exists at period end. So titignan natin tong disbursement na to, baka may binayaran tayo na hindi naka-record dito pero binayaran natin dito. And we look if ever it exists at period end. If ever it exists at period end, then you need to adjust your FS. You adjust your FS for the unrecorded liability. Next, we test for unprocessed invoices or open purchase orders. Or generally, we try to look into the PO, and from PO, we test the invoice and receiving reports. PO, we test the invoice and then receiving reports. So how do we test the PO and look into the invoice and receiving reports? Generally, ang gagawin nyo dito, magsasample kayo. Kukuha kayo ng isang PO, tapos imamatch nyo sa isang invoice at saka receiving report. And look whether that particular invoice or receiving report pertains to the period end. Ano ba to, sir? Meron kang purchase order. As of year-end, akala mo hindi mo siya na-record or walang liability. Pero pala, while you look into the invoice or receiving reports, na-receive mo na pala siya and you already have a liability. Therefore, what should you do? You try to adjust the financial statement and effect the liability uncovered. So that is the test for unprocessed invoices or open purchase orders. Again, when we try to search for unrecorded liabilities, we test the completeness assertion because normally liability is understated. And what are the audit procedures pertaining to the searching of unrecorded liabilities? The first audit procedure is to review subsequent cash disbursement. So we look into our cash payments subsequent year, entries if ever, or look if ever the liability is present there. Therefore, we need to adjust our FS. Or we recommend that the management or the entity should adjust their FS. Also, we test unprocessed invoices or open purchase orders. Open purchase orders means they are not yet entered into the books. But if you look into POs and trace the invoice and receiving reports, if ever there is a sufficient appropriate evidence to prove that there is a liability, then again, we recommend for an adjustment. That is for unrecorded liabilities. Now, another under identifying liability items is your litigation and claim. For litigation and claim, what do we do again? We try to satisfy the completeness assertion. We again try to satisfy the completeness assertion. And what is that assertion? That all liabilities are properly recorded and at the same time disclosed in your financial statement. And we test this completeness assertion because, again, we said liabilities, as a general rule, tend to be understated by companies. So since companies, ginagawa nila, binababaan nila yung liability nila, then we do this at completion. So what are the audit procedures pertaining to litigation and claims? The following are your audit procedures. The first audit procedure is to identify the existence of any litigation or claims. Next, we try to communicate with the entity's lawyers, and these entity's lawyers are normally external lawyers. Furthermore, we meet with entities' legal counsel. So let's look at it one by one. Let's start first with the identification of existence of any litigation and claim. So what are the different audit procedures to identify existence of litigation and claim? So the following are your audit procedures. First, you make appropriate inquiries of management including obtaining representations. So tatanungin na agad natin si management kung meron silang pending litigations or pending claims. And based on that particular inquiry, hingi tayo ng representation dyan. If ever, we can also review minutes of those charged with governance and correspondence with the entity's legal counsel. Why? Because normally, those who represent the entity is those persons charged with governance. So if we try to look into the minutes of the meeting of those charged with governance, maybe we can uncover any litigation or claim. Again, our main audit procedure here is to identify whether there is a litigation or claim. So to determine whether there is a litigation or claim, ano bang gagawin natin? Sabi natin una, mag-inquire ka sa management. Baka sabihin nila, Sir, paano kung hindi nila sabihin? E di, you review the minutes of the meeting. And what minutes of the meeting will you review? Normally, those charged with governance, because those charged with governance are the ones who will represent the entity for any litigation or claim. And look if ever there are any letters in between those charged with governance and the legal counsel. So that we can say, meron talagang litigation or claim. What are other audit procedures para masabi nating may litigation or claim? You look into legal expense accounts. If ever lalo na recurring yan, recurring legal expense accounts, for sure there is currently an existing litigation or claim. So you look into legal expense. If ever there is a recurring legal expense, you ask why. Is it only pertaining to uh, monthly legal expenses, or is there really a litigation? So you try also to look into if ever there are fluctuations. Aside from examining legal expense accounts, you use any information obtained regarding the business, including information obtained from discussions with any in-house legal department. So, if ever once you determine that there is really a litigation and claim, then our next audit procedure would be to communicate directly with external lawyers. So, alam na nating may litigation and claim, tama? You already identified that there is litigation and claim. So, ano din ang next na gagawin na natin? Magko-communicate na tayo with external lawyers. So, question, when will you only communicate with external lawyers? You will only communicate with external lawyers if ever litigations or claims have been identified or you believe they may exist. If ever it is already identified, then it's easier. But if ever you believe that it only exists kasi hindi naman sinabi, you only seen it under the minutes of the meeting, you base it on your analytical procedures on the legal expense accounts, then you just believe that it exists. So your next step is to communicate directly with your external lawyers. And how will you communicate with them? You communicate with your external lawyers through first letter of general inquiry, next is letter of specific inquiry. So the question is, when will you use letter of general inquiry and when will you use letter of specific inquiry? If ever, unlikely yung response ng ating external counsel, unlikely ang response ng ating external counsel, then letter of specific inquiry. Pero kung tingin nyo naman, kaya niyang sagutin yung letter of general inquiry, then general inquiry. Again, when will you communicate? You already identified that there is a litigation or claim. So when can you identify it? You can identify it if ever, of course, it is communicated by the management. Okay? Next, if the auditor believe that it exists. And how will you determine it exists? Through your analytical procedures. Aside from your analytical procedures, you look into the minutes of the meeting. Now, and how will you inquire or communicate? Either general inquiry or specific inquiry. So paano sir? Specific nga siya pagka unlikely hindi sasagutin ni external counsel yung general inquiry mo. Pero kung tingin mo sasagutin niya, edi magbigay ka ng general inquiry. So let's look into the letter of general inquiry. So what is your letter of general inquiry? Letter of general inquiry is a letter which requests to inform the auditor about litigation and claims the counsel is aware of, together with, first, assessment of the outcome, second, a possible estimate. Okay? So whether it is probable, whether it is possible, and what is the estimated cost, if ever. Because generally, we look whether it is probable and measurable. But if ever, ang tinatanong naman natin sa counsel ay yung assessment niya lang kung probable ba siya or hindi at kung anong possible estimate nun ng implications and costs. Take note, magja-general inquiry ka kasi nga alam mo na rin and alam din ni counsel. How about letter of specific inquiry? Letter of specific inquiry requests to inform the auditor of the following. First, bibigyan ni counsel si auditor ng list of litigation and claims. Next, yung alam ni counsel na assessment ni management dun sa litigation or claim na yon, including its cost. So ganito, ano bang difference niya? Doon sa general inquiry, ang gagawin lang, si counsel ang magbibigay ng kanyang assessment at estimate. Sa specific inquiry, ang mangyayari, bibigyan ni counsel si auditor ng litigation and claim. And based on the litigation and claim, magbibigay din siya ng alam niyang information coming from the management and coming from the own legal counsel or from their own regarding the assessment and estimate. So, ibibigay muna niya kung ano yung assessment ni management and kung anong estimate ni management doon. Furthermore, itatry natin kunin ang reasonableness ng assessment at estimate. So, we try to request the legal counsel to confirm the assessment made by the management and at the same time, the estimate on the cost and implication. Ulitin natin. Once you determine there is a litigation or claim, your next step is to communicate directly with external lawyers. So when will you communicate uli? Pagka lang nalaman mong may litigation or claim. Your next problem is how. Dalawa, pwedeng letter of general inquiry or letter of specific inquiry. Kailan lang? Unahin mo muna ng letter of general inquiry. Assuming hindi siya sumagot, edi mag-specific inquiry ka na. Pero kung sasagot agad siya ng letter of general inquiry, edi mas mabuti. Anong laman ng general inquiry? Sasabihin lang ni counsel doon yung assessment niya at saka estimate niya regarding litigation or claim na alam niya. Take note, alam niya. How about in specific inquiry? Hindi natin kasi alam kung ano yung alam niya, halimbawa. So bibigyan niya tayo lahat ng listahan ng alam niya na litigation or claim. And based on that litigation or claim, it includes the management assessment for that outcome and at the same time, an estimate for future implications or costs. And aside from that, the council itself should provide a reasonable assessment as to the assessment of the management and as to the estimate of the management. So titingnan lang natin whether he considers them reasonable or not. Okay? So once we finish identification and communication with external lawyers, and still you think communication is not enough, then you try to meet with entities legal counsel. So when can you meet with the entity's legal counsel? First, if the auditor determines that the matter is a significant risk. If you think it is very probable and at the same time it could yield to bankruptcy, let's say, then that could be a significant risk. Next, if the matter is complex. And lastly, there is now a disagreement between the management and entity's legal counsel. Normally, this disagreement is a disagreement as to the litigation or claim. As to the litigation or claim. Or if ever, ayaw na talaga mag-participate ni management kasi nga, nag-away naman talaga sila nung counsel. Or ni counsel, ayaw niya rin mag-participate kasi nag-away din talaga sila ni management. Okay, ulitin natin yan. Litigation and claims. What are your audit procedures? First audit procedure, identification of any litigation or claim. How do you identify? First, inquiry. You inquire to the management. If not, then you review the minutes of those charged with governance. Take note, charged with governance, not only the minutes of the meeting of the board, but charged with governance. Why? Because normally those charged with governance represents the entity. So since they represent the entity, normally they know if ever there is a litigation or claim. Also, you look into the legal expense accounts. You do analytical procedures on your legal expense accounts. Once you identify, your next step is to communicate with external lawyers through letter of general inquiry or through letter of a specific inquiry. And if you're still not satisfied because it is too significant and the matter is complex, then you try to meet with entities legal counsel. By the way, although for sure you already know who should prepare the letter and who should send the letter, let's just review it. Who prepares the letter? Prepared by management and sent by auditor. And the letter should request that the counsel should communicate directly with the auditor. Again, if any letter, it must be prepared by management and then it is sent by auditor. And the directive on the letter is that any answer on the letter should be communicated directly to auditor. It must be communicated directly to auditor. Now, what is the effect? What is the effect, guys, on our audit report if ever the management does not want to prepare the letter or the legal counsel does not really respond? Okay, so our main problem here is that since yung letter kailangan i-prepare ni management, what if hindi niya i-prepare? Or nung kinontak na natin or minute natin si legal counsel, hindi naman siya nag-respond. So what is the effect on audit report when the management refuses to give permission or the entity's legal counsel refuses to respond appropriately to the letter of inquiry? It is tantamount to scope limitation. And since there is a scope limitation, then um, you need to qualify your opinion or give a disclaimer of opinion. Again, if ever there's a refusal to communicate with external legal counsel or the legal counsel does not respond, then it is a scope limitation. The effect is that your audit report, hindi na siya unqualified, pero qualified na siya, or there is a disclaimer of opinion. That's it for your identifying liability items. So since we already finished the identification of your liability items, the next item under completing the audit is the addressing required disclosures. Addressing required disclosures. So the first disclosure, if you still remember, under required disclosures, we have 4 items, right? Related parties. Aside from related parties, we have going concern and then subsequent events, And then, the adequacy. For adequacy, generally, this is not discussed kasi nakalistahan lang naman yan. From the list, i-check mo lang if ever nag-disclose siya. So, ang main na tinitignan mo ay related party, going concern, at saka subsequent subsequent event. Let's start first with your review of related party transactions. So in your review of related party transactions, let's look into the management responsibility and the auditor's responsibility. So the management responsibility as to related party transaction is that they must identify and disclose related party and related party transaction. They must, again, identify and disclose related party and related party transaction. Who is a related party again? A related party is any party in which there is control or there is a significant influence. One party has either control or significant influence over another party. So we call that related party. How about a related party transaction? For related party transaction, this is any transfer of resource or obligation. So meaning it can be an asset or a liability between the related parties. Regardless whether, of course, there is consideration or there's no consideration. Related parties, again, pursuant to your PFRSS, is defined as someone or one party has control or significant influence over another party. And related party transactions are the transfers of resource or obligation between the related parties. This is even with or without consideration. So therefore, in the financial statements, the management must identify and properly disclose related party and related party transactions. So yun yung responsibility niya. So sa FS dapat naka-represent doon or naka-present doon ang related party at related party transaction. Under saan? Sa disclosure niya. So now, what is the responsibility of this auditor or of the auditor as to the representation of the management? Your responsibility is to review related party transactions to ensure that they are identified, recorded, and disclosed. Next, we obtain a written representation as to the completeness of the identification of related parties and disclosure in the FS. Kasi sabi nga natin, these are representations by the management. And once there is a representation, that representation must be included in the management representation letter. So generally, your main focus here is to review what is represented. And what is represented? The related party transactions and the disclosure of those. Aside from that, related party transactions, since we're talking about control or significant influence, there is a person or entity charged with governance because one controls the other or one has significant influence over another. So we look into the charge with governance responsibility. So in your charge with governance responsibility, their responsibility is to obtain information from management to enable them to understand the nature and business rationale of the related party relationship and transaction. Furthermore, they need to monitor how the management is discharging the responsibility for such control. So, ang tinitingnan dito is normally control. So, this is more of test of control. Kaya dito sa ating unang related party and related party transaction, meron pa tayong substantive test soon or audit procedures because we look into related party transactions. But here, since it is purely control, do we have any substantive tests? Wala na kasi we only test the control here. So what is your responsibility then? Your responsibility is to obtain understanding of the control and consider whether the control is adequate. Ulitin natin ha. Dito sa una, meron pa tayong substantive test. Why? Kasi i-review natin yung related party transaction. Pero dito sa charged with governance responsibility, meron pa ba tayong substantive test? Wala na. Bakit nga? Kasi nga, ang titignan lang natin dyan ay yung control. So since ang titignan mo lang ay control, tignan mo yung responsibility mo. You understand the control and you consider the adequacy of the control. So since yan lang ang titignan mo, no more substantive test. It is purely test of control. It is purely test of control. Therefore, when we go to the next slide, for auditor's responsibility or the audit procedures, they are geared towards the first auditor's responsibility as to the review of related party transactions. Sir, paano naman yung obtain a written representation? Nasa ating audit documentation na yan, audit reporting and communication. So, i-discuss natin yan pagdating natin doon sa management representation letter. So, our main issue lang natin dito ay paano natin i-audit ang related party transaction under number 1. So, let's look at it. So, how do we audit review of related party transactions? So take note, we try to review it. So how do we audit or review that? First, we identify, and then after we identify, we do now your audit procedures. So first, as to identification. So to identify whether there is a related party or related party transactions, the following are to be done. First, you provide personnel performing all segments of the audit with the names of known related parties para malaman nila yung related parties. Next, you review the minutes of the meeting kasi baka may merger, may consolidation, may purchase ng investment na may significant influence, etc. Next, you look into the filings with SEC and other regulatory agencies. Why? Kasi normally, pag may merger or consolidation, magre-report sila yan sa SEC for the merger or any plan of merger or consolidation. Next, you look into the conflict of interest statements obtained from clients' management. So normally, if there's a conflict of interest, pwedeng maging reason yan to determine or identify that there is really related party. Next, you review businesses transacted with major customers, suppliers, borrowers, and lenders. Why? Kasi normally, pag major yan, possibly, it is a related party. So kung laging-lagi doon ka bumibili, doon ka nagpapautang, or doon ka umuutang, possibly, baka may related party between that. And those entities did not only disclose the relationship. Take note, if alam mo na, walang problema. Pero, paano kung unknown nga? Kailangan hanapin mo siya. And paano mo siya hanapin? Ayan ang mating mga audit procedures. Next, audit procedure. Consider whether unrecognized transactions are occurring, such as receiving or providing accounting, management, or other services at no charge. Because possibly, meron palang subsidiary and ang entity natin ay yung parent. And this parent provides for the administrative work of this subsidiary through accounting, management, or other services. So since it is undisclosed, malalaman natin na, baka may related party dito. 7. Review accounting records for large, unusual, non-recurring transactions or balances, especially those near at the end of the period. Kasi pag sobrang laki niyan, tapos hindi mo masyadong binabayaran yung utang mo, baka related party kasi hindi naman kailangan related party mo, parang utang mo lang siya sa sarili mo. So since it is too large and it is unusual also, then possibly there is a related party. Large, unusual, non-recurring transactions or balances. Next, review invoices from law firms. Sir, bakit pa namin review yung invoices from law firms? Eh di ba na pag-usapan na natin yan sa claims or litigation. Claims or litigation yon. Pero yung invoices, pwede rin kasi yon normally during merger or consolidation or purchase of interest, we seek the help of lawyers or law firms to draft, of course, the merger or consolidation. So since we need to pay them a fee for merger or consolidation, we look into the invoices. Baka kasi hindi siya dinisclose, tas makikita mo doon, uy, may invoice for a possible um, or for merger or for consolidation. Therefore, there should be a related party. Next one, review confirmations of loans receivable and payable for guarantees. Why? Because this might be a intercompany receivable or payable. Intercompany receivable or payable. And once there's intercompany receivable or payable, there is the presence of related party. Okay. Pag alam mo nang may related party, hindi ka na mahihirapan. Paano kung hindi mo alam na may related party or tinatago niya yung related party? Kailangan mong gawin tong iba't ibang audit procedures na to. Now, after you identified the related party, the next thing to do is to review. So, to review, first audit procedure is we need to understand the business purpose of the transaction. Baka naman, hindi naman yan control, baka venture yan, or baka naman walang significant influence kahit ganun yung percentage niya. Next, we examine now invoices, executed copies of agreements, contract, and other documents. Baka talaga may related party or related party transaction. Next, determine whether the related party or related party transaction has been approved by the board of directors or other officials. Take note, during merger or consolidation, there must be a required voting. Okay? So may votation dapat and kailangan ma-meet nila yung voting na yon. Next, you test the reasonableness of the compilation of amounts to be disclosed or considered for disclosure. So you will now disclose any related party transaction, intercompany sale, intercompany purchases, intercompany transfer of property, plant, and equipment, intercompany accounts receivable or accounts payable. Next, arrange for the audits of the intercompany balances. So normally, we look into the different intercompany balances now and test those balances. Next, we inspect or confirm and obtain satisfaction concerning the transferability and value of any collateral. So if in case there are collateral between related party, we look if ever we will transfer those and we look into the value of that collateral to be indicated on our financial statements or on the financial statements of our client. Okay? So ulitin natin. Kanina, may management responsibility sa ating related party and related party transaction. And based on this, we have an audit procedure. Pero kung charged with governance responsibility, walang audit procedure kasi generally, test of control yan. Wala na tayong substantive test. So ano ang audit procedure natin sa sa related party and related party transaction? We need to identify and review the related party and related party transaction. How? The following audit procedures. It is now laid down to you kung paano mag-identify at paano mag-review. Now, paano kung may related party, paano kung may related party or related party transaction at ito ay hindi accounted or disclosed? Hindi siya accounted or disclosed. First problem, if ever you cannot obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence for related party, that is considered scope limitation. Next, paano kung kulang yung disclosure niya? It's either qualified or adverse. Paano kung hindi accounted, qualified or adverse? So in short, we need to identify, right? We need to identify. So if properly identified, ang main problem mo lang whether related party is accounted or related party is disclosed. So if it is not accounted, paano uli? Qualified or adverse. Not disclosed, qualified or adverse. Paano kung you cannot obtain sufficient evidence? What if you cannot obtain sufficient evidence? Then that is considered scope limitation. You have qualified or disclaimer of opinion. Qualified or disclaimer of opinion. That is for our related party transactions.